Yes, good morning. It's Wednesday, the 12th of August 2020. My name's Pete Fairbairn. Welcome back to the best on ground weekday kickoff. I'm joined by Darren Parkin down in Melbourne this morning. How are you, Darren?
Morning, mate. Going well.
It's always a pleasure to have you on the show, Darren. We've got 5 massive stories to sink our teeth into. We've been up bright and early, scouring the newspapers and seeing what is making waves in the world of sport. And it'd be remiss of me up here in Queensland not to kick things off with the Brisbane Broncos. We probably talk about them a little bit more than I'd like on this show, but from a salacious headline perspective, they're the gift that keeps on giving. We're not going to talk about Anthony Seibold too much and the fact that he's now taken legal advice around some rumours which are flying around the internet in relation to his personal life. Of course, we know that he is currently in Sydney away from the team dealing with a personal matter. We're going to talk about Broncos star Tevita Pangai Jr., who was served with or will be served with a breach of contract notice for his COVID-19 offence after becoming embroiled in a police raid on a bikie-linked barbershop last Saturday. Of course, he shouldn't have been there outside of the bubble. There's also, I guess, the image that the club don't want of him consorting with these known speculated bikie members. Pangai Jr., it was only last week that he had to come out and publicly address the fact that he'd been speaking with other clubs potentially and selling his services beyond this season, to the likes of the Sydney Roosters. And speculation via the Courier Mail today from Peter Bedell and Travis Main that the Brisbane Broncos are actually going to sack Pangai Jr. for this COVID breach and for the damage he's done to the club's reputation. This is a club in chaos, Darren. I mean, they're going through their worst ever season. The coach is already on notice. He's not there at the moment. They've lost their most exciting young player, and David Fifita will leave at the end of the year to join the Titans. We've got Darius Boyd retiring at the end of the year. He doesn't want to be part of the leadership group at the moment. Pangai Jr. being sacked, from the outside looking in, it's a pretty bold call by the Brisbane Broncos. He is, of course, a really talented footballer. Do you see this as a bit of a line in the sand moment for the Brisbane Broncos, or do you think this is only going to continue to create division within what appears to be an already divided playing group?
I think it's a line in the sand, or that's how it has to be taken. I guess it's a multi-layered one in the sense that if you took COVID completely out of the picture, it would be a pretty significant breach in any case. Obviously, the image around the fact that it's linked to a bikie club involved in a police raid as well in regards to Mongol bikie gangs and all of that's a horrible look for the club. And then you factor in that it's a COVID breach on top of the fact that the league had multiple COVID breaches in the week preceding that, with players using fake names at cafes and various other things as well. It's just obviously not a good look for the competition. So if you took COVID out, it would almost be a sacking offence anyway. And I guess sooner or later the club has to say, look, we've got to take control of our direction again, and we understand that it might mean we've got to bite off something significant, but we can't allow this to continue. And we've seen everything. Obviously, the club's under attack on social media, as we know. The performances have been significantly found wanting along the way. But, yeah, I think this is a moment where they're left largely with no choice based on the context. COVID, criminal investigation, on top of what the league has gone through of recent times and on top of where the club is at. It's a perfect storm, I think, that leads to that outcome. And it's unfortunate. A lot of people in commentary last night were saying that you should have to have multiple breaches. It shouldn't be a case of just bang and you're out. But that also, on top of the fact that his future is uncertain anyway, I think they had to come to that conclusion.
And what we'll be watching, I guess, with real interest will be whether, if Pangai Jr. is sacked, whether you see any of his close relationships with that club decide that they also don't want to be part of that future. And it could be a real clearing of the decks at the Brisbane Broncos. We move from rugby league to the AFL, and quite the opposite situation. GWS Giants desperate to keep a hold of their free agent, Zac Williams, who's basically left a sizable 5-year contract offer from the Giants on the table and unsigned since last year as he weighs up his future. We know that many other clubs, not only just in Victoria, but also in other states, have registered an interest in Williams. He's a dashing halfback. He's a good user of the football. We don't know what effect COVID is going to have on the AFL salary cap and list sizes heading into 2021. We also know that GWS have to try and retain Jeremy Cameron, who's arguably the biggest free agent of the year and one of the highest paid players in the competition as well. They've managed to retain the likes of Stephen Caniglio and Lockie Whitfield, Toby Green, Harry Himmelberg in recent years. They've been happy to throw big multi-year deals at these players in order to try and keep them together and chase an elusive premiership. As someone who watches a lot of football and obviously works in the game, how important is Zac Williams to that GWS side? Will they be able to keep hold of him, and which clubs probably need him the most and will be chasing the hardest?
He's an interesting one, Zach, because he's a native of New South Wales. So generally, if we look at player retention for GWS, it's guys that they've brought in from outside their state rather than somebody that's sort of grown up. I know he's from Narrandera in New South Wales, which isn't obviously all that close to Sydney, but it's still obviously a native of the state. He would demand probably up around the $750,000 mark as a running defender who uses the ball really well. There's always a number of clubs that are in that position. Generally, the Giants have been, I mean, they routinely lose players every couple of years, but they rarely lose players that weren't, I guess, expendable. I mean, with the exception of, say, Dylan Shield, who went to Essendon. They've either lost guys that got squeezed out on the way up. So Treloar obviously ended up being a star, but was just coming through. Taylor Adams, another one. Jack Steele, Josh Bruce, those sorts of players. It's very rare they've lost someone that was at the top of the tree at the time. Zac Williams would be in their best 8 to 10 players, not in their best 5 or 6, but would certainly be a really important player for them. Clubs that could always do with that sort of run-off halfback, you would think. I mean, you look at clubs that replenish their list frequently to contend, like Richmond, but you'd be probably looking at teams like Hawthorn, teams like Melbourne, those sorts of teams that would be, feeling that they could tinker with a few things with what they've got coming up, and it might be the difference, to push them into the finals mix. But most clubs, I think, would inquire about those services. Carlton are probably another one based on where they're at as a group at the moment. So the only clubs you would say that wouldn't do that would be clubs that obviously have an abundance of run-off halfback clubs, perhaps like the Western Bulldogs or teams of that particular ilk. But they'll certainly demand a fair degree of attention, but it is rare they lose a New South Welshman.
Really quickly on this one, as the games become increasingly inside and congested, the ability to get an elite or very, very good outside player can have a significant transformation on a club's fortunes. Look at St Kilda with the likes of Brad Hill and Zach Jones coming in this year. Do you think that if you take COVID out of it for a moment, the inside nature of the game actually provides an opportunity for these elite outside players to have a real boost in the types of earnings that they might be able to get?
Yeah, and they certainly stand out more when obviously you see that opportunity for run, and you look at teams like St Kilda and Port Adelaide and even the Gold Coast who have improved a little bit. Those teams that play sort of bold, fast football, and Brisbane being another one, and how there's still room for that in the game. And they're obviously sides that have had pretty positive results over the course of the season. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's still important to get that blend. Obviously, you can't be all one way and not the other. And I think when you see somebody that can run and carry and use the ball so well, they stand out perhaps more than they ever have before.
That story from Jake Niall in The Age. Our third story today, and staying with the AFL, Collingwood did manage to keep that donut for the Adelaide Crows last night, coming from behind at halftime to have a relatively comfortable 4-goal win in the end there. Collingwood, obviously, the feel-good story of the night was the return of both Tim Broomhead and Lyndon Dunn, who'd both been out of the AFL level for a long, long time due to injuries, and Dunn scoring a goal, which was wonderful to see. Nathan Buckley, speaking after the game, talked about how top 4 is extremely relevant this year for your double chance in the final series as opposed to a home final. He said you need to win enough games to qualify, but you need to look after your squad well enough to have access to the right guys when you get towards the end of the year. He spoke about that because there's been a lot of not just rotation, but also a lot of injury and a lot of uncertainty as to what Collingwood's best 22 looks like at the moment. Where do you think the Pies are at? Should Nathan Buckley be talking about top 4 conversations, or is this a team that's really in a battle to simply make the finals? And do you think Nathan Buckley knows what his best 22 looks like?
I guess the answer is probably a bit of both, that they've got to shore up their spot. But in saying that, at the start of the year, I would have had them as premiership favourites when they had most of their group up and about. So for them, it just comes down to personnel, and that's been the case for probably 3 years. Even in 2018, when they made the grand final, they were injury ravaged for most of the season. They started to get most of their list back at the end when the whips were cracking. Last year, again, they had some concerns, and last night they were severely depleted. That I think was almost Adelaide's worst loss. Now, they had played lesser teams than Collingwood, but Collingwood was so decimated in terms of quantity but quality of players out that made that a really poor loss, particularly given they led at half-time. Credit to Collingwood for that, obviously getting some left field performances from guys like Rusco that kicked a couple of goals for them. Dunn kicking that goal before half-time was massive. But yeah, Collingwood are a potential top four side when everything is up and about. It's not at the moment due to injuries, but clearly they've obviously got to work within what they consider themselves to be capable of, and that is contending for a flag. But obviously, if they finish seventh, it becomes incredibly difficult. So there's 6 wins, 4 losses, and a draw. They should get Pendlebury back soon. Jamie Elliott should return. Obviously, Darcy Moore is another one. The long-term injuries are De Goey, Jeremy Howe, which will be a big loss for them over the course of the season. And Treloar, with his hamstring issues, has probably got another few weeks out of the game. So they won't contend if they don't get, at least probably 70% of those guys back. But they are capable of contending. Their capabilities put them amongst the best 4 to 5 in the competition.
Our penultimate story today, we turn to the A-League competition and the Western Sydney Wanderers. The Western Sydney Wanderers have perhaps flown under the radar a little bit that they will miss out on the finals for a 3rd consecutive season. We know that the Central Coast Mariners haven't finished in the top 6 either, throughout that time and a little bit longer. But the Wanderers, the only other team in the competition missing the finals for a 3rd straight season. It's been quite a fall from grace for a team who've only been in the competition 8 years, had an instant impact when they joined the A-League. Of course, won that Asian Champions League title in 2015 as well. They're a club with a big fan base. We're going to see a 3rd Sydney team enter the competition next year. John Paul DeMarini, the Western Sydney coach, has welcomed the possibility of an independent review into what's going wrong at that club, as reported by Don Bossie in the Sydney Morning Herald, and DeMarini replacing Marcus Babel halfway through this season, and he'll be backed to turn things around next year. How have the Wanderers suffered such a fall from grace, Darren, after bursting onto the scene when they did first join the competition?
It's interesting, obviously, with Tony Popovich initially at the helm and their success. I think they made 3 A-League grand finals, won one of those, and obviously had that success in Asia along the way. Their supporter base is enormous when you factor that in, as opposed to other new clubs that sort of join the competition around the same time. You get challenges when a new side comes in, but they're still in a fairly rich region. Obviously, after a period of time at the top, you can drop away. There were some list changes. There's been some talk, obviously, behind the scenes as well. Their captain, Mitch Duke, is likely to head to Saudi Arabia, as we know, and but they are confident on keeping a couple. But there's always been those sort of background discussions around players' futures, coaching staff's futures. And I guess the COVID thing creates an interesting context. It's both a good and bad time, I guess, to be going through some struggles. There's a relative anonymity, given the sense that the sport is not in a holding pattern per se, but there's all this uncertainty around, were they going to come back at all? What does it look like? We've obviously even seen Sydney not at their absolute best since returning to the fold this campaign. But at the same time, that the league has so much uncertainty. They're going to bring in a new team, but what's their financial position? So it's a tough one for them to go through, but they are a club that makes a lot of noise. They're a club that expects things very, very quickly. They don't rest on their laurels too much as a new entity. So they'll certainly shake the place up a little bit. And they are one of those clubs that does make the competition quite healthy when they're playing well.
Yeah, I think with the Wanderers, obviously, their investment in in their academy and in their facilities has obviously been pretty significant as well. A strong Western Sydney Wanderers, I think, is really important to the ongoing success of the A-League. Our final story today takes us to cricket.com.au, and a story from Laura Jolly, which shows that Cricket Australia is in talks with their counterparts across the ditch in New Zealand for the Australian women's cricket team to head on over there and play some one-day internationals and T20s. In fact, they may fly over there as soon as the back end of next week, I should say. next February, I should say. Last Friday's announcement that the International Cricket Council had decided to push the 50-over World Cup back to February-March 2022 due to the ongoing COVID pandemic has left a major hole in the women's calendar. Early next year, we know that tournament's going to be held in New Zealand. An opportunity for our girls to get over there and get some extra match practice in those conditions, having not played there since 2017, would be pretty important, Darren.
Yeah, it would. And I guess it's an interesting one in New Zealand on a watch this space. We know COVID is a big watch this space, but obviously Auckland going into stage 3 lockdown in the country, I think going into stage 2 over the last sort of 24 to 48 hours with a few unknown sourced cases of COVID around that area. So I guess we watch this space there like we do everywhere else. But New Zealand have made busy sporting plans. They've been obviously fairly effective in their handling of COVID, but then it's a case of opening up borders and what challenges that poses in terms of where they're coming from and the potential risks involved in that and the quarantine process. They've announced a pretty busy men's summer, New Zealand, with obviously a host of teams coming out. Here in Australia, we're expecting India in the back end of this year, but what does that look like given their COVID problems and ours? So they're the challenges that are waiting. But as you say, the women's team haven't toured New Zealand since 2017. New Zealand are an ever-emerging team on the women's side of it, certainly challenged that hold that Australia and England and India have had over the women's game for a while. So it's important that we start to put these steps in place. February sounds reasonable, particularly given the proximity of New Zealand and the prospect of that travel bubble. But I guess we do watch this space, but it would be important with the World Cup in that country in 2022.
And it's worth saying that, with COVID, we've seen a lot of sporting organisations around the world probably look to cut costs, and in a lot of instances, women's sport is one of the first ways in which organisations have looked to do that. Great to see Cricket Australia here really putting a real focus on the women's team, still 18 months out from that World Cup, and ensuring that they do whatever they can to get them some top quality opposition and get them back playing sport. Darren Parkin, thank you so much for joining me this morning. It's always great to have you on the show. I hope you go out there and have a cracking day today.
No worries, anytime. We are 1 hour outside, will be well spent.
Mate, enjoy it. Our thoughts are with, of course, all our friends in Victoria and also now in Auckland who are watching and listening to the show. Look forward to welcoming Christy Doran to the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff tomorrow. We'll talk to you then. Cheers.